So I received a question today from someone who asked, can you please explain what the universe is? And is the universe ultimately what I am aware of in the present moment? Um, and I think it's a interesting question to start from, because it enables for an unpacking of some answers to that question. But really, the answers can't be answers specifically to that question, what is the universe? Because the truth is that we don't exactly know. But what we can say is, let's answer that question in a way that is meaningful relative to certain objectives, certain topics. Because if we come to understand the universe in a way that is relatively useful, which might mean it might not be exactly what the universe is, but it's a useful way in relating to what the universe is, i.e. it helps to see the universe this way in order to bring about and help as part of the transformation that we're really talking about in these talks. So before I do that, I think it's important to say, so what are these talks really about? The talks are about happiness in daily living, happiness for the human being in this life, which we can call daily living. And what is happiness? It turns out that happiness is happiness through peace of mind. So really it's a changed experience of life, from an experience of life where there is an uncomfortableness with oneself to an experience of life where the uncomfortableness has fallen away. And we tend to feel, when life is like that, that we are happy. If we're asked when we're experiencing like that, are you happy? You don't even really need to ask, what does that mean? You just feel like you're not unhappy. And if you've been living like that with a conscious recognition of the alternative, which is being in life where there is this uncomfortableness with oneself, uncomfortableness with the other, then there's an appreciation that that is unhappiness. And the absence of that unhappiness is a great relief. And in fact, the more we look at it, it's what's really available. The ending of a certain attitude to life that adds a layer of uncomfortableness on top of the inevitable pleasures and pains of life. So if we're talking about happiness in daily life, it makes sense for us to ask, what is daily life? And when we're answering these questions, I think we need to answer the questions based on an investigation of life itself. And if we come up with any models, if we come up with any concepts, any theories, they have to be concepts or theories that we can reconcile based on our own experience. And furthermore, it needs to be an assessment of our experience that is detailed enough to not take one aspect of the experience, for example, and draw a conclusion that isn't supported by other aspects of the experience. So I would start off suggesting that daily life for all of us is what we can call our own personal consciousness experience of life. That at night, when sleep happens, and let's talk about deep sleep, so not the dream state, but when the daily life experience isn't there and the dream state experience isn't there, and let's assume there is this state of deep sleep where there is no experience of a world. So that, I would say, is the absence, the absence of daily life, the absence of the personal consciousness experience. And then we wake up in the morning, and that is the arising, the forming, the presence of personal consciousness experience. And when we shift from the waking state to what we call the dream state, the daily life experience is replaced by the dream experience. Now, if we look at the daily life experience, it's very clearly an experience of time and space, experience of what, at least in experience, feels like an objective reality, or a material reality. And that material reality seems to unfold in time, moving in a particular direction, and there are lots of cosmic laws. And one of the cosmic laws that's here is the law of causality. And causality requires time and space in order for that to happen. Causality really means, you turn on the kettle and things happen. And once you've turned on the kettle, the element starts to heat up, and then the element heats up and heats the water up, and then the water boils, and then you put it in your tea and you get tea. So there's a causality to life. Things don't just seem to appear without something coming before them. Now, that's an investigation of the content of the daily life experience. When we take a zoom out, if we can become aware of the fact that all of the content is completely dependent on awareness being present, that as soon as any content is outside of the field of awareness, the field of awareness that we can say is local or somehow linked to or seems to be linked to the body object. Any object that is outside of that field of awareness ceases to exist as part of the experience. So, in a way, what we need to do is start to be able to look at the life experience from several perspectives and try and come up with a model that makes most sense, a model that isn't denying some of the components that are here, and that isn't focusing too much on some and drawing conclusions that conclusions that don't have a good answer as to when someone asks you, why do you conclude that? So what's often missed is the fact that the daily life experience is a personal consciousness experience. That's most people will go through life. It seems like human development is such that we develop to not realize that the trees and the people and the cars arise within a consciousness and are therefore essentially a modulation. They are an interpretation or a created world. The question is, what if we realize this? We then say, what creates this experience that is arising only in the present moment? So, humanity as a whole hasn't investigated the present moment such that it's realized to be an experience, meaning something, of the visual aspects, the sound aspects, the tactile, the touch aspects of life, all require awareness to be there in order for them to be known, for them to be experienced. And if we really appreciate this, we'll start to see that we don't really know the object itself, but an image of the object arising in consciousness. When this isn't appreciated, then life is seen to be something outside of what we are. And so the tree seems like because this is how that experience that is arising within consciousness, unless it's investigated, it just seems like the object, the tree or the chair or the other person, is outside of who I am, outside of me. And I am seeing that which is outside. Now, there might be something outside that is creating the image, or there might be something out there, an actual objective tree, for example, that becomes part of the conscious experience because the light that is bouncing off the tree is received by the human being, and then a model is created in the mind of the human being. Or there might not be a tree out there. What we know is that there is an experience. Everyone is having an experience that is arising in consciousness, and that the person, what we know as the body, is actually part of that image. Just like the tree is part of the image in the or the experience. Now the question is there an objective reality outside of the image, or isn't there? And sometimes we can get carried away with what is important to know. We might think, well, that's what we need to know. And I'd say that it's actually largely irrelevant as to whether we know if there is an objective world of trees and people outside of the experience, or whether there is no objective world and the experience is created within a higher consciousness, let's say. So if we go into spirituality and philosophy, there are lots of models, and I have to say that I haven't spent time going into philosophy to understand the nuances and the particulars that fit into one model versus another model. And there are some models that are very close and only differ on small aspects. And so they fit into the same general category, but they have, specific names within that category because they differ slightly. And then there are other models that are essentially completely looking at life differently too. So we could have, for example, there's dualism and materialism. There's idealism is another model. Now, the non-dual representation is probably closest to the idealism model in philosophy, if not the same. And that says that all of life that we know is arising in consciousness, and that there is no objective world outside of the appearance in the moment. And when we enter into spiritual seeking, it's very often the first time we've come across an alternate view of life. And if it resonates, if it brings about change, we might actually believe that now we know the truth because we come to see life differently. And because it's changed from one to the other, we might assume that now we see the truth, we see reality, whereas before we were stuck in the prison of illusion. And the concepts that are delivered in teachings are there to bring about the important shifts. And in order for them to bring about the important shifts, the concepts need to be delivered in a certain way. And sometimes the way that they're delivered is as if they are absolute truth. So an awakening can be described as an awakening to the fact that the experience of life is in fact an experience arising within consciousness. That the whole of what we know as daily life, or you could say the universe, arises inside what I am and not arising as something outside of me, which was the previous way of experiencing life. So when that shift happens, thankfully, because of the teachings that have said life is not that way, life is this way, then we're prone to sticking to that model as being the truth of the universe. And so there'll be a lot of people that are convinced, just because a shift happens that reveals something, there'll be a lot of people that are convinced that there isn't an objective world. There is just the arising in the present moment. Now, why will they be convinced of that? Because their experience has changed to reveal that, the arising in the present moment. And it's changed because the teachings have said there is no objective world. So if a teaching says there's no objective world and it brings about a shift, our intellectual bias is going to start relating to the teaching as if it's truth. Now, teachings will tell us in the teaching, somewhere embedded in the teaching, and teaching will say, in this teaching it says, whatever is shared is a concept and not the truth. Whatever has been spoken about, written down by myself or by anyone in history or anyone in the future is always a concept and not the truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. Now, that itself, the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. That itself is a concept and not the truth, according to the earlier concept that says whatever is shared is a concept and not the truth. So why would I tack on to the end of that, the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am? Because it's important information to be delivered in the form of a concept, because it will serve, if ingested by someone, it will serve a useful purpose. And at first it might be taken to be the truth, because it says the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. So even if we see that as a concept, we might say, but it's pointing at something. It's using the word truth, the only truth. It's like saying it's categorizing the impersonal sense of I am in a separate category to everything else, because it's important. The impersonal sense of I am is important. And so teachings are doing these sort of things all the time. And the teaching will warn us not to believe a teaching. That doesn't mean disbelieve it. It doesn't mean ignore it because it's not the truth, because it's just a concept. It means use it as a tool and then be sure to recognize it as a tool and not carry the tool around with you as if it is the thing itself. So the simple versions of these reminders in some teachings are one that says, use the boat to get to the other side of the river, but then don't carry the boat around on your back. Don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. Don't mistake the map of the territory as the territory itself. At some point, if you see Buddha on the road, kill him, which means psychologically you have to let go of the teachings of Buddha. And often when we value the teachings, we then value the teacher. And so this is saying you need to be prepared to kill the Buddha. It means to cut the link between yourself and the Buddha, yourself and the teachings. Ramana has a little parable that I think is most apt in pointing what I'm talking about out, and it says, use this thorn to remove the thorn embedded in your thumb. And so in this little story, the thorn is a spiritual concept, or any concept, but in the case of a spiritual teaching, it says use this thorn, which is a spiritual concept. Let's say you are not the body, is a spiritual concept. Not the truth, a spiritual concept, a tool to remove the deeply embedded thorn in your thumb. So that's a concept embedded in the thumb, represents a concept that has been turned into a belief, a concept that is being taken to be absolute truth. And the concept embedded in our thumb might be the concept, I am the body. So use this thorn. You are not the body. You are consciousness, or you are the self. You are awareness. To uproot the thorn embedded in your thumb. And if that happens, that may actually be part of the awakening or the awakening moment. But be sure to throw both thorns away. Now that part's not there because Ramana expected someone to be able to remove the thorn and then throw both thorns away, but rather to be a hint for someone to check and see if a previous concept has in fact become embedded in place of the concept that was removed because a forgetting to throw or a non-realizing about how important it is to throw both thorns away didn't happen. So if we check and we realize, oh, I've taken this notion, I am not the body, or I am formless awareness, to be some sort of absolute truth. I might have taken the notion that the universe is a dream arising in God's mind as some form of absolute truth. I might have taken that description, and I would argue tooth and nail, if I believe that, with anyone who says that there could be an objective world. We might say, no, there's no objective world. How do you know that? Well, because I've had an awakening that shows me everything is arising inside consciousness. And nothing exists outside of it. So how do you know? I'm not arguing with the fact that there is an awakening that shows that the experience of life, or what we can call the universe, but really it's the experience of a universe, more specifically the experience of daily life, arises as an appearance in consciousness. I'm not disputing that. So when we hear spiritual teachings, traditional ones and modern ones, talking about life as a dream, life as an arising in consciousness, I completely agree. That to me is something that is quite indisputable and confirmable based on an investigation of the life experience from many different perspectives. Will come up with the conclusion that even if life does include a universe of physical planets, a world of soil and trees and rocks and rivers and all of that, if that is actually there, and the human being is what it appears to be, which is evolution of that life from simple life or simple complexity to a much greater complexity that includes the development of a brain that has intelligence, language, more complex preferences, the capacity to contemplate one's own existence because of the intellectual capacity of the brain, then even if that is the world out there, based on how science understands, so if there is that objective world, then we have to say science that is investigating the objective world has got things more or less, has been observing the objective world. And so then we have to run with the explanations that the eyes receive light waves, and then the brain receives those electrical signals and turns it into a visual representation. We create a model of life based on all of the stimuli coming in from the external world. And so what we experience as the world is the model created by the brain after receiving all of the stimulus that the brain has learned how to interpret and create a certain image of the world that we then populate with an image of the body and with a sense of who we are. And so when we're functioning in what we would assume is the external world, we're actually aware of the brain's modulation. And you can start to see this when things start, well, what we call, malfunctioning in the brain, and then the model can start to do some strange things. And if we take some substances that affect how the signals in the brain work, then certain additions can happen in the model that is created by the brain. And we can also play around with the brain. So neuroscientists and neurosurgeons can do certain things, and the image will change. And the way that the image is interpreted changes. So based on how science explains it, it becomes obvious that our experience of the world is an arising in a consciousness, is a dream in a sense, a dream that is created by the physical brain. If there is no objective world, which means no objective human that is receiving any light waves or sound waves from an objective world, then this is all a virtual creation, essentially a play of consciousness in the mind of God. And that is the description that is generally given to us in non-duality. Now, why is that given to us? Not because understanding the nature of life like that is what's most important. What's really most important in spiritual seeking, and we need to ask this question, is what are we practically looking for? What will enlightenment give us that we didn't have before? Now, someone might say, what it will give you is the understanding that life is an arising in consciousness. You didn't have that before, and then awakening happens, and you did have it. I say, so why is that useful? What will I really have after that I didn't have before? They go, well, you have this different perspective. So what does it deliver in practical terms? Someone might say, what do you mean practical terms? Isn't that enough that you now see life as an arising in consciousness instead of an objective reality? I say, well, I don't think it is enough. If that was it, what if you remained as miserable and uncomfortable in life after you see it as a dream as you did before? Have you really gained anything? Is that knowledge that it's all a dream, is it really useful? It's sort of like the same error happens when we think we're seeking for truth. And what happens is the word truth is we attribute a certain value to the word truth. So I said, what will we have after we have truth? Someone said, well, you'll have truth. Then, well, what's truth going to really give me in practical terms? Well, why do you need truth? Isn't truth enough? I say, well, I might think it's enough if I turn truth into something and I say, well, at least I will have this valuable thing, truth. But why is it valuable? So when we really start looking at things practically, what we might realize at some point is what our unhappiness is, what is driving us to seek something. And we'll realize that what's driving us to seek something is an unhappiness. And maybe we will then reassess what we're really looking for. And what's actually what I'm looking for. When we get humbled, when life really smashes us down after we've been in truth and oneness experiences and all that, and the flip-flopping happens, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. When life keeps smashing us down and we keep finding ourselves, even when we think we've gone very far, sort of back to where we started from in suffering, at some point we might realize, actually, I'm just looking for the end of suffering. if I let go of the conceptual idea of what I might be looking for, like oneness or truth, or even just a word, enlightenment. I say, what's enlightenment? Oh, I don't know, but there's books written about it, and it's said to be something pretty important. So I'm looking for enlightenment. So we can turn a concept into what we believe we're looking for and miss the practical thing that we are really looking for. When we come down to it, we say, actually, you can have your truth. You can have your enlightenment. What I would like is just to be able to live a life free of this uncomfortableness. Now, the good news is that liberation, according to my concept, is the same as the end of uncomfortableness. Truth, oneness, a part of the journey towards the end of suffering. And we might sometimes think that it's all about that rather than seeing that that is part of the journey towards the end of suffering. So believing that life is just an arising in consciousness. And what is consciousness? Whose consciousness? Oh, the consciousness of God, of Brahman. Every made of God. All there is Brahman. All there is consciousness. Now, there's a lot of value in those teachings. They are stories. Stories are very useful, and they reveal aspects that need to be revealed, but they usually reveal them and then leave them cloaked in certain misunderstanding that we think is understanding, we think is truth. So if someone is convinced because of an awakening that there is no human being, there is no objective world out there, because that's what I used to think, and it kept me from seeing life as an arising. So then we see life as an arising, and then we think that that proves that there's no external world. So that's an example of, unfortunately, belief, which is not much different to religious belief. In principle, it's not necessarily the same belief that keeps us even more locked in suffering, because there's a big, that awakening is a big part of the movement towards freedom. But let's not get stuck there. Let's realize, do I know that this is true? Or am I just believing that because I've become aware of life as an arising in consciousness, that I now know that there is nothing outside of it? No real rivers that exist independent of my awareness of them. I agree that the experience for you of the river only happens when you are aware either of the real river, if there is one, or within the experience. Both of them are within your own experience. So what we come to see is the experience that doesn't prove that there isn't actually a river that we are receiving information from to turn into the experience of the river. Another notion can be that, because of how it feels, that what I am was never born and will never die. So this sense, becoming aware of a deep aspect of the human being or the human experience, the sense of self, we can refer to it, or the sense of I amness, or the awareness that is aware of all of the objects. Those are all aspects of the human being or the human experience that tended to be obscured. And so they are described a certain way when we don't see them, in order for us, hopefully, our attention and our own awareness to land on those things or those aspects, those components that are being described. They're described a certain way, And then if they reveal themselves, often because of the pointers that turn our attention in that direction, we might believe them to be or have certain characteristics, or believe ourselves to be exclusively a characteristic that has been pointed at. And in fact, the pointer might tell you that you are exclusively that and nothing else in order to bring awareness on it. So this sense of I amness, or the sense of self, which can feel very personal when certain other components of the life experience are not present, like in a meditation, or if we've trained, we've become designed, let's say changed, in order for the modulation of life to be created without certain thoughts, then the experience can feel much less personal. And when it feels less personal, it feels like there's nothing of the human being in it, that it isn't something that is born, because what is born clearly is the human being, and what we awaken to is a sense of self that we're told is not part of the body, is not subject to time and space, and it doesn't feel like it has time and space in it. In fact, it feels eternal and infinite and formless. And because that's how the experience of that aspect of life experience feels, we tend to say that's how it is absolutely, that's the truth of the matter. Now, the reason the teachings described it that way is because that's how it needs to be described for us to become aware of it. And then when we feel it, it has those components. But when we start asking some more questions, we might start questioning how absolutely true the concepts are that helped us. So, for example, what you are was never born and will never die. What you are is eternal. Now, that's what it feels like. But are you sure? When you're grounded and sitting in it, being, so it may be even easier in a meditation state, and you're just being that ground of existence, the self that has no personal characteristics. And so any self-residual residual self-image of being a person has fallen away in that experience. And then we say, of course, there's no one here to have been born and no one here to die. And so we then think, yes, that's right. What I am was never born and will never die. And that's pointing to something, but we shouldn't take it absolutely. We shouldn't take it as the truth, or at least if we're going to take it as the truth, we say, let me check if I know this for sure. So when we're resting in it, we find it doesn't tell us that it was here before the body was born. It might have a quality of that based on how the experience arises. When I'm talking about experience, I'm talking about resting in being, just isness, I amness, the self with a capital S. But if we apply some critical thinking and realize that believing something that is not self-evident is dangerous, and we might realize that believing something that appears a certain way, that feels a certain way. So someone might say, but it is self-evident that it was never born and never dies. So, well, what's self-evident is what's self-evident in the present moment, but does it really tell you that when the body wasn't before the body, the sense of self existed? And we can be so, in a sense, brainwashed by the concepts that I'm not criticizing. I'm saying they're important. They need to take us through these phases. That we become convinced that the experience tells us, informs us, not through words, but in a direct way, we are that, and we believe that we know that we were never born and never die. That aspect of life, the awareness or the beingness, was never born. And I say, you can't know it. Like, I know this from an experience because I asked myself this question: do I know? Because I was looking at the spiritual beliefs. Because, Raman says, be sure to throw both thorns away. I said, do I know that this self was never born and will never die? Now, I thought this was a dangerous thing to question because that seemed to be the basis on which peace of mind existed. It seemed like peace of mind exists because what happens in the flow is not so important, because what I am is timeless. What I am is eternal. It seemed like the fear of death had fallen away, probably because there was this recognition of the self as being something that was never born and will never die. So when my own thinking, the working mind that understood some of the trappings of our thinking, because we haven't really been taught how to think well. So when that part of my mind started to ask this question, I thought this could be a problem, because what if I find out that what I am was not necessarily never born and doesn't necessarily never die? But I didn't dwell on that for too long, because something that had become clear is that belief is the problem. Belief is what keeps us away from truth. So I didn't want a belief to go unquestioned, especially a fundamental belief like this. And so the conclusion I had to come to when I was running on my own experience, but my experience of being, right? We can't really answer this question if we don't have the experience of being. But if we do have the experience of being, then we can answer a question about being, like, do we know it wasn't born and won't die? And I had to say, well, no, I don't know that. And I was waiting for the suffering to come flooding back in. And as I thought was a possibility, but I was also a little bit concerned, but I thought it was a possibility that maybe the suffering won't come flooding back in. And it didn't. Having dropped the idea that what I am, as far as I can tell, may not necessarily be unborn and may not necessarily never die. And so once the suffering didn't come flooding back in, I was able to reconclude that peace of mind is available not because what I am was never born and will never die, but because what I am knows that it is, knows that I am now. And so the conclusion was, because that knowing I am is a preconceptual knowing, meaning not a knowing of concept, but a direct eminence of our own nature, that aspect, the consciousness aspect of the human being. The conclusion is, we can be at peace because I know I am. And that knowing that I amness is not interested in whether it was yesterday or whether it will be tomorrow. What it is focused on and appreciating and satisfied by is its own existence now. So the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. It's important for us to find this dimension of the human, this layer of the human, that I've described in other talks as the quantum aspect of the human, to find a stepping out of the form aspect of life, at least stepping out with 1 foot, so that 1 foot is firmly planted in the quantum, the other foot is firmly planted in the material, which means we haven't dissociated from being human. We're not denying the existence of form and time and space and causality and outcomes and pleasure and pain. but we also now have access to a part of being that we can rest in and know that even when circumstance is not ideal, that what I am right now at my core is not affected by circumstance. Not as a belief, but as an actual appreciation based on a resting in that aspect, meaning having access to that aspect of the human being. Now that's one aspect of the human being. The human being, according to this teaching, is consciousness linked to a particular body-mind organism and functioning through that body-mind organism. Now remember not to take the concept too absolutely, because it doesn't mean that the truth of the matter is that it's consciousness from outside the body coming into it. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that the consciousness is actually an aspect, a creation of the physical being that exists in a physical world, which is the physical world from which the experience that we have is a reflection of. And if that's the case, then consciousness is an intrinsic aspect of the human being. And in both cases, whether consciousness comes from outside the human being and then functions through the human being, or whether consciousness is an output of a physical organism, in both cases, the world we have is an arising inside a consciousness. And in both cases, within that experience, there is access to this deeper aspect that I'm talking about. Now, we don't need to know whether that is the consciousness of God or the consciousness of the human being. The fact is that there is a consciousness and we can rest in it. And as far as our happiness goes, which is really the end of suffering simply comes when the human being, which is within this experience of life or part of the experience of life, changes in such a way that the belief in personal doership falls away. The attachment to outcomes, meaning the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, falls away. And so if you ask me what model I run with, I'll tell you the model that has developed over a period of 25 years of spiritual seeking and teaching is a model that is continually refined based on an appreciation of the experience, a questioning of it, a questioning of what I know and what is just theory, and what is useful theory but not held as belief. In the end, we end up with a model that I say, this is the model that I run with. I don't hold it as truth because we don't know. We don't have enough evidence to know what's what exactly. But there is more than enough evidence to know certain things within the model. And I see no reason why not to assume, because it doesn't hurt, that what we see is a world of time and space causality that appears to be a reflection of an objective world, and a reflection that falls away when the human being goes to sleep. So I think the most healthy and balanced model to run with is a model that assumes that there is an objective world in a universe of time and space and planets and stars that doesn't necessarily follow only linear rules. So I would say the model I run with is that there is an objective universe, and that objective universe is not as straightforward as Newtonian physics, but probably includes the aspect of quantum physics, which suggests that there is entanglement theory, that there is aspects of time that are not linear, that things might be happening simultaneously, that matter arises out of emergent patterns that are not as real as they might seem, and yet there is still the physical aspect. So the quantum aspect does turn into what we experience as physicality. So I don't think we can ignore the physicality. So I'd much rather run with a model that says there is a universe of form and time and space, and as we go deep into that form, time and space, we find the quantum levels, but both the material and the quantum are part of that universe that has an independent existence from my awareness and from everyone else's awareness. But every one of us is essentially an expression, a creation of that physical world. So that physical world has spawned life in its basic form, and that life got more complex to the point of dinosaurs and then human beings. And that complex physical computer created a modulation of life because it was part of the evolution of the human. It helped to create a model of the outside world. And what we know as daily life is the model that the human being that exists in the objective world has created. And so this person, this arises within the model, however, meaning arises within the modulation of life that the physical brain has created. And there is a version, the real version, you could say, of the physical entity outside of the model. And the model is an approximation of what exists outside of the model. And that's a blend of the idealism, which says everything arises in consciousness and there is no external world, a blend of that idealism, and a blend of dualism, or no, materialism, that says this is a physical world with humans in it. So what the blend is saying there is a physical world that has evolved to its current form with humans, and the world we experience, the daily life world, is a modulation, is a simulation created by the brain of a primate that has developed to be able to create an aware, conscious simulation of life because it's useful. So then the question is, to the human being that exists as a character in its own modulated creation of an external world, what is the purpose? And many people will answer that question differently. I've found that if we keep it practical, what the character in the modulated world, which is all we're going to ever know, we can't know the external world. Firstly, because we are the character in the modulation of the theoretically existing human. Now, let's say there is no external world, there is no theoretically existing primate out there, then this is still here. The experience of the world is still here. So one way or the other, whether it's created in the brain of a primate, or whether this is an arising in some universal God, we're still left with daily life being something that we have to navigate, something that we can't escape from. And when we look at it in practical terms, spiritual seeking has arisen because of the uncomfortableness in this life, which we can't escape. But what seems to be available is a transformation of the character in the dream such that the character can experience life free of suffering. Now, I would go back to the model I suggest, because what that means is that there is a change actually happening in the primate, the real biological instrument. Changes is happening, that changing the nature of the dream that we live, or that we call life. It's changing the nature of the self, and the self actually is the character. The self populates the modulated world that the brain creates, and the self is the character that the brain sticks in to the world to live the world. And what we find is the uncomfortableness is based on how that self knows itself. And how that self knows itself is dependent on how that self knows what life is. And so as the self starts to appreciate life differently, eventually it starts to appreciate itself differently, and some of the characteristics that cause suffering fall away. The belief in personal doership falls away, because the character realizes that what it is dreamt up, is created by the brain that has decided that this is how it's going to create the experience of the world. And so that character, what we know as ourself, might realize it can only function the way that the creator of the dream allows it to function, or forces it to function. And as it starts to realize this about itself, the resistance to what is happening in life falls away, because it realized that, if something falls off a tree, no one has done that. And similarly, if someone acts a certain way, the other that is acting is not someone, but something that is part of the overall experience of life. And as the character in the dream starts to become more aware of itself, it starts to realize that the peace, the self-contentment, comes with a knowing of itself, an understanding of life and itself, not from the world delivering certain outcomes. So the fear of death falls away when the character starts to understand that it never has had a continuous existence. And so when it starts to appreciate that the experience of life is the way it is, even without a continuous existence, that essentially it is populated in the dream of life each time afresh, that the end of it doesn't have the same meaning as it had when it thought itself to be objectively real with a continuous existence, especially when it thought that its meaning in life is in achieving things that it hasn't yet achieved. So then it is going to be struggling psychologically against the notion of it not existing. Because if it doesn't exist sometime, then it's going to feel like its mission and its purpose is cut short. And so the sense of self is going to feel very challenged by the notion of death. But when the character becomes aware that what it is part of a momentary experience, and that it is fresh each time, and that its happiness is simply comes from landing, from awareness landing on its own existence in this moment, then it says, yes, just like at night, in deep sleep I cease to exist, and there's no one there to have a problem with that. So death, at some point, death happens, and the experience of this person's life ceases, and there'll be no one there to have a problem with it. And we then also start to find where true meaning comes from, in addition to the understanding of oneself. We find ourselves in life still, and so we have to be doing something. The story of life will have us doing something, and we might have found that by then the movement from being a self-centered entity that is looking for pleasure for me because we think that's where we're going to get completeness from, that's fallen away. And so then we think, okay, well, I guess the value on a circumstantial level comes from one, aligning and doing more of what I enjoy, which is really is a feedback loop happening with what the character in the dream is realizing, is really a realization of the entity in the real objective world. So that means the entity in the real objective world is deciding, okay, now that I'm having an experience of life where I'm at peace, and I understand that the experience that I'm having is a modulated experience of the world that's actually in, that it's in, then it says, well, let me just do things I enjoy, things that give me value. And those things are obviously in line with its preferences. And we find that our preferences can tend to include an altruistic aspect that they didn't before, when we felt very egocentric, looking for completeness through pleasure. And we realize that we want everyone else to be happy if possible. We want everyone else to have a good life. So where we can help others, we will. And so we start to get a meaning in life based on things that didn't seem important before, or in fact seemed like they would be a hindrance to the meaning we believed was here, which was seeking in outcomes. So today's discussion is the sort of discussion, or not discussion, talk that I sometimes go into, which is looking at the models that might explain what life is about, what the universe is about. So the question was asked, can you tell me what the universe is in brief? I'd say the universe is a physical entity that came into existence at some point, let's say the Big Bang, and it's not really important, exists outside, life formed, a human being formed, the intellect and the brain developed in such a way that it also developed the capacity to create a simulation of the external world, which is all we ever know. We are the character in the simulation of the external world in which our God essentially lives. Our God is the actual human, let's say it's a human, in the real world. And what I look like, in theory, is a representation, because this tree is a representation of a tree that actually exists in the world, and this room is a representation of the actual room that exists in the actual world. So even though on the one hand what I know myself as is the image of myself, it's an image made in the image of God. And who's the God of this? In my explanation, it's the human being. But the human being is part of a bigger system, the system of the universe, the system of the world, or earth, let's say. So that human being, even though it's the God of this world, is not independent from the actual world in which it exists. And then at some point we stop needing to relate to this as just a dream or experience, and say this is an experience of an objective world. And then we meld the character and God, become one, and we live as if we are the doer, as if life is real, continuing to have to function in the circumstance we find ourselves in, hopefully with the dissolved beliefs that were put in place when life was experienced a certain way. So seeing life differently can hopefully dissolve some of the beliefs that lead to suffering and lead to a sense that there is no meaning or fulfillment in life. So this is a little different to the normal talks. Hopefully you can tie it back into happiness for the human being. Now, I'm not saying that the model I've put forward is the absolute truth of how things are. But a lot of the other models, like the one that says everything is arising in God and there is no objective world, I see as being very useful to create awakenings and to create certain detachments and to break certain beliefs. When you really investigate it from a point of questioning some of the things that have been set in place, I remember a time when I laughed and laughed and laughed at the notion that I was believing in the non-duality God that is omniscient, in which the whole universe arises. Why did I laugh and laugh and laugh? I laughed because I believed in a God that seemed to make so much sense until I realized it's very unlikely that in which all of this arises actually exists. All of the realizations that happen in the non-dual path, of which, from personal experience, I know them. The awakenings are not imaginary. They are the awakening that can happen even in the model I explained, an awakening to the fact everything made of consciousness was by consciousness is applicable regardless of which of the models you use. So those awakenings, if someone says, you've got it all wrong because prove that there is no objective world, I'd say, well, I've had the awakenings. When I look back at them, I can't see any awakening to the nature of life as one arising in this monotheistic, dual, omniscient God. I hope I've for me, because these gods and that seed has been planted and it won't just be able to be turned away from. At some point, we need to start asking ourselves, am I keeping it real? And starting to come back to practice. So I'll end today and won't take any questions today. But tomorrow is we're on Sundays, Friday, Sundays of the day. On Saturday, go back and listen to the dates. Of my visit to Ramesh when I first went to Ramesh, which demonstrates essentially the pivotal point in my journey from the non-dual awakened state, where quite a lot of peace of mind was in place. The esoteric world, not too detached from certain concepts. And um, and that's a regression away from what has been realized, because what has been realized is the oneness of life, and that the duality is an illusion, that causality isn't, that there is no human being or no person on all of the platforms.